There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has no name. It settles into your chest quietly after a long day of being good, of holding doors, of softening your words, of saying it's fine when something wasn't quite fine. You drive home and feel it sitting there. Not guilt, not sadness, something softer and stranger than both. You have been kind and somehow you are tired. This is where the real conversation about kindness begins, not in the bright spaces where it's celebrated, but in the dim and honest corners where it gets complicated. Because somewhere along the way you were told that kindness was simple, that it was just goodness in motion, just warmth expressed freely, just the natural overflow of a generous heart. And sometimes it is. Sometimes kindness is exactly that, uncalculated, unguarded, given the way sunlight is given, without accounting for who receives it or what they do with it. But sometimes, if you sit very still and listen to the quieter parts of yourself, kindness is something else entirely. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes it is a door you keep others behind while calling it a welcome. Sometimes it is the most sophisticated form of control you have ever learned to exercise over a world that once made you feel powerless. That is not a condemnation. It is an invitation to look more honestly. Psychology has a term for this. It's called prosocial behavior, the umbrella under which kindness lives academically. But what the textbooks don't always tell you is that prosocial behavior, like almost everything human beings do, operates on a spectrum between the deeply genuine and the deeply strategic. And most of us, most of the time, are somewhere in the middle, not monsters, not saints, just people who learned very early that being good was the safest way to be loved. Think about when you first learned to be kind. Not the philosophical moment, not the lesson in a classroom, the actual first memory of it working. Of someone's face softening because of something you said or did. Of the warmth that followed, that small glow of approval settling over you like something you didn't know you'd been cold without. Your brain registered that. Your dopamine system, the brain's ancient reward architecture, the neurochemical that signals this matters, do it again, lit up in response not just to the act itself but to the response it generated. You were kind. You were rewarded. A pattern was born. This is not cynicism, this is just how human beings are built. But here is where it gets more interesting and more tender. For some people, that early lesson in kindness arrived inside a home where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned, where peace had to be maintained at the cost of honesty, where the only way to feel safe was to make everyone around you comfortable first. Attachment theory, which maps the invisible architecture of how we learn to connect and to trust, tells us that children who grow up in unpredictable emotional environments learn to regulate those environments. They become the peacemakers, the helpers, the ones who notice before anyone else does when the room has shifted. They become, in other words, extraordinarily kind. And that kindness is not false. It is not performance. It is survival, transfigured by time into something that looks like virtue. The kindness is real, and so is the wound beneath it. Perhaps you felt this, the way your generosity sometimes has a faint edge of anxiety to it. The way saying no to someone's request doesn't just feel uncomfortable but feels almost dangerous, like something fragile might break. The way you give and give and give until you are empty, and then feel quietly resentful, and then feel guilty for the resentment, and then give more to compensate for the guilt. This is not weakness. It is a very old strategy that once kept you safe, still running its program in a body that no longer needs it the same way. Psychologists sometimes call this fawn response, the fourth stress response that doesn't get talked about as often as fight, flight, or freeze. It is the impulse to appease, to soften, to make yourself palatable in the presence of perceived threat. And for many people who grew up loving unpredictable people, kindness became the primary language of that response. You learned to lead with sweetness so no one would leave. And here is the dark truth that isn't entirely dark. This kind of kindness still contains something genuine. The care is real. The desire to ease suffering is real. The warmth is not manufactured, but it is entangled with something else, with fear, with a locus of control that sits entirely outside yourself, with the quiet belief that your worth is directly proportional to your usefulness to others. Locus of control is the psychological term for where you believe the power over your life resides inside you or in the reactions and approval of the people around you. When you are chronically, compulsively kind, your locus of control has often migrated outward. You measure your okayness by how okay you make other people feel. You take the temperature of every room and adjust yourself accordingly. It is extraordinarily skilled. It is also extraordinarily costly. The cost is this: you never fully arrive. Because when your kindness is a form of management, not emptiness, but control, not love, but strategy, you are never quite present with another person. You are always slightly ahead, calculating, anticipating, preemptively smoothing. The genuine encounter that intimacy requires, the one where two people meet in their unfiltered reality, without performance, without agenda, keeps getting pushed just out of reach. You are there, but you are also always working. And the people in your life sense this, even when they can't name it. They receive your warmth and are grateful for it, and yet something in them hungers for something they can't quite identify, for the version of you that isn't managing them, for the version of you that simply is. True kindness is not the absence of need, it is presence without pretense. There is another dimension to this that deserves more light than it usually receives. Kindness, when it operates as a social currency, creates invisible ledgers. You may not consciously be keeping score. In fact, you may resist that idea strongly, because the story you've built about yourself centers on being someone who gives without expecting anything back. But notice what happens inside you when the kindness is not returned. When you make yourself small so someone else can feel large and they don't even seem to notice. When you absorb someone's hard mood and soften it with patience and gentleness and they walk away without acknowledgement, there is something that moves in you in those moments. Something that feels, if you are honest, remarkably like disappointment. This is not a character flaw. This is cognitive dissonance, the psychological friction that occurs when what you believe about yourself and what you actually experience don't line up. You believe you are giving freely, but something in you was, in fact, hoping. That hoping is worth honoring, not suppressing. Because the hope inside your kindness, the hope that it will create safety, that it will make you beloved, that it will finally prove you are enough, that hope is not shameful. It is profoundly human. It is the original hope of every child who ever tried to be good in a world that sometimes felt too large and too unpredictable. You were not wrong to want love. You were not wrong to reach for it with the tools you had. But you are older now and the tools deserve re-examination. Not because they were bad, but because you are capable of something deeper. Not performance, but presence. Not management, but genuine meeting. Not the carefully constructed offering of a self that anticipates what others need, but the full and somewhat ungainly and deeply beautiful reality of who you actually are. What would it mean for you to be kind from fullness rather than fear? This question is not rhetorical. It points to something that takes real time to locate inside yourself, this other kind of kindness, the one that doesn't cost you your wholeness. The one that arises not from the anxious monitoring of what others need, but from a genuine, unhurried, sovereign care. Psychologists sometimes describe this as autonomous motivation, doing something because it aligns with your deepest values, not because external approval depends on it. Kindness sourced from this place feels different from the inside. It is lighter. It doesn't accumulate into exhaustion. It doesn't breed the low, sad resentment that comes from chronic overgiving. It simply flows the way a conversation flows when you are truly interested in the person sitting across from you, when the time passes without your noticing, when you walk away feeling more like yourself than when you arrived. This is not withdrawal, it is a homecoming. There is something worth understanding about the people in your life who have mastered this, who are kind without being soft, generous without being boundaryless, warm without being consumed. They have not achieved this through detachment or discipline or the strategic rationing of care. They have achieved it through a particular form of honesty, an honesty that begins with themselves. They know what they need. They know what they can give. They know the difference between empathy and absorption, between compassion and self-erasure. And because of this knowledge, their kindness arrives clean. It does not carry within it the quiet demand to be received in a particular way. It does not flinch when it is not acknowledged. It is given and then released, the way a breath is released fully without attachment to what happens next. You have met these people even briefly, you remember them. And you also know perhaps that the kindest act you have ever experienced in your own life was not always the softest one. Sometimes it was someone who told you the truth when the easier thing would have been agreement. Sometimes it was someone who said, "I can't give you that," with such clarity and gentleness that you left the conversation feeling, somehow, more respected than refused. Sometimes it was someone who simply did not pretend, who sat with you in the full difficulty of something without rushing to make it better, without offering the hollow comfort of silver linings, without shrinking the complexity of your experience into something more manageable for themselves. That kind of presence, steady, honest, unafraid of the weight of things, that is perhaps the most radical form of kindness available to a human being. It is rare because it asks something enormous. It asks you to tolerate your own discomfort in order to genuinely witness another person's. Most kindness, by contrast, is more about managing discomfort than witnessing it. This is the dark truth, if it can be called that, though perhaps deep truth is more accurate, because there is nothing in here that isn't also strangely tender. The dark truth is that much of what you call kindness has been, in part, about you, about your need to be seen as good, about the anxiety that rises in you when someone is unhappy and you haven't yet found a way to help, about the identity you've constructed carefully over years around being the person who shows up, who gives, who holds. And that identity is beautiful. The care it contains is real. But it has also perhaps kept you from the full intimacy of being known, truly known, because the kindness has functioned as a shield as much as a gift. A carefully curated presentation of the most lovable version of yourself, offered preemptively, before anyone could see the less lovable parts and decide they weren't worth staying for. What would it feel like to let someone love the parts of you that are not generous? Somewhere in this question lives the beginning of a different relationship, with kindness with others, with the complicated, sacred, unfinished self that you carry quietly through every room you enter. The self that is sometimes impatient, sometimes depleted, sometimes selfish in small and human ways, sometimes too tired to be warm, sometimes in need of being held rather than always being the one who holds. This self is not the enemy of your kindness. It is its ground. Because kindness that grows from someone who knows themselves, who has made room for their own darkness, their own need, their own ordinary failures, is kindness that can be trusted. Not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. Because it comes from a person who has not outsourced their self-worth to the gratitude of others, who does not need your admiration to know their own value, who gives not from the compulsive overflow of an anxious heart, but from the quiet, solid, chosen overflow of one that has learned, slowly and with difficulty, that it is already enough. This is the kind of kindness that doesn't exhaust itself, that doesn't keep score in the night, that doesn't curdle over years into bitterness. It is, in the most complete sense of the word, free, given freely, received freely, and released into the world without demand. And you are more capable of it than you know, not by becoming less kind, but by becoming more honest, not by caring less, but by understanding at last the full cartography of why and how you care. Because somewhere between the kindness that protects you and the kindness that liberates you, there is a threshold, and crossing it is one of the quietest, most consequential things a person can do. The most generous thing you will ever give anyone is a version of yourself that doesn't need anything in return for being there. And that is not indifference wearing kindness as a costume, but the real thing, forged in full self-knowledge, given from a place so whole that the giving doesn't diminish it.